What happens when absolute power meets absolute skill? When a decorated admiral's arrogance collides with a Navy SEAL's lightning-fast reflexes? The answer came in less than 3 seconds during what should have been a routine briefing at Naval Base San Diego. This isn't just another military story. This is the true account of how Lieutenant Commander Jake "Phoenix" Morrison, a battle-hardened SEAL with 12 years of classified operations under his belt, did something that no one in that room, including 3 admirals, 2 colonels, and a dozen senior officers, thought was possible. The incident lasted mere moments, but its shockwaves are still felt throughout the Navy today. It's a story about respect, hierarchy, and what happens when a man pushed too far decides he's had enough. Most importantly, it's about the thin line between following orders and standing up for what's right. What you're about to read changed everything for everyone in that room. And once you know the truth, you'll understand why this story has become legend among those who serve. The morning sun cast long shadows across Naval Base San Diego as Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison walked towards Building 47. His boots made sharp clicks against the polished concrete, each step carrying the weight of 12 years in naval special warfare. At 34, Jake had seen more combat than most soldiers see in 2 lifetimes. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and places that didn't officially exist on any map had shaped him into something more than just a Navy SEAL. Jake's reputation preceded him everywhere he went. His teammates called him Phoenix after a mission in Kandahar where he'd been declared KIA, only to emerge 3 days later having single-handedly eliminated an entire Taliban cell. The scar running from his left temple to his jaw served as a permanent reminder of that particular resurrection. This Tuesday morning felt different, though. The quarterly Joint Operations briefing was supposed to be routine, but Jake had learned long ago that nothing in the military was ever truly routine. His commanding officer, Captain Richard Hayes, had pulled him aside the day before with an unusual request.
Morrison, Hayes had said, his weathered face showing concern.
Admiral Blackwood specifically requested SEAL representation, and frankly, you're the only one I trust to handle whatever political nonsense he's cooking up.
Admiral Theodore Blackwood was a name that carried weight throughout the Pacific Fleet. At 58, he'd climbed the ranks through a combination of political maneuvering and strategic timing rather than combat leadership. Unlike Jake, Blackwood had never seen real action. His closest encounter with enemy fire had been during training exercises 30 years ago. Jake entered the briefing room at precisely 0800 hours. The space was sterile and formal, dominated by a massive mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs. American flags flanked a wall-mounted screen, and the air smelled of fresh coffee and floor wax. Officers were already seated, their uniforms pressed to perfection, ribbons and medals creating colorful displays across their chests. Admiral Blackwood sat at the head of the table, his posture radiating authority. His grey hair was slicked back perfectly, and his pale blue eyes surveyed the room like a predator assessing its territory. To his right sat Admiral Patricia Vance, a respected officer who had earned her position through merit and sacrifice. Colonel James Rodriguez occupied the chair to Blackwood's left, his infantry combat ribbons telling a story of genuine battlefield experience. Jake took his assigned seat halfway down the table, noting the subtle tension in the room. Other officers present included Colonel Sarah Mitchell from the Marines, Lieutenant Colonel David Park from Air Force Special Operations, and several Navy captains whose expressions suggested they'd rather be anywhere else. "Gentlemen, ladies," Admiral Blackwood began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Today we're discussing the restructuring of special operations protocols for the Pacific Theater. For the first hour, the briefing proceeded normally. Maps were displayed, tactical scenarios discussed, and resource allocations debated. Jake contributed when asked, his responses precise and professional. He participated in hundreds of similar meetings, understanding that most of the real decisions were made before anyone entered the room. Admiral Vance presented a proposal for enhanced joint training between SEAL teams and Marine Force recon units. Her presentation was thorough, backed by solid intelligence and real-world experience. Jake found himself nodding along with her recommendations, recognizing the tactical wisdom in her approach. The success rate of combined operations has increased by 37% when SEALs and Marines trained together beforehand, Admiral Vance explained, clicking through slides showing statistical analysis. Lieutenant Commander Morrison's team participated in the pilot program, and their feedback has been invaluable. That's when Admiral Blackwood's demeanor shifted. Something about sharing credit seemed to irritate him, and Jake noticed the subtle change immediately. Blackwood's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his fingers began drumming against the table's surface. While Admiral Vance's presentation is adequate, Blackwood said, the pause loaded with dismissive condescension. I believe she's overlooking some fundamental realities about chain of command and operational hierarchy. Admiral Vance's face remained neutral, but Jake saw her shoulders stiffen slightly. She'd been in the Navy for 26 years, commanding respect through competence and integrity. Hearing her work dismissed as merely adequate by someone who'd never led troops in combat was clearly getting under her skin. Sir, with respect, Admiral Vance replied carefully, the data clearly shows.
The data, Blackwood interrupted, his voice rising slightly, shows whatever we want it to show.
What matters is maintaining proper order and ensuring that everyone understands their place in the hierarchy. The room fell silent. Jake felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always preceded trouble. He'd seen this dynamic before, usually right before everything went to hell. Bullies in positions of power rarely stopped at verbal intimidation. Colonel Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His combat experience had taught him to recognize dangerous situations, and this was rapidly becoming one. Lieutenant Colonel Park kept his eyes fixed on his notepad, clearly hoping to avoid becoming a target. Admiral Blackwood stood up, walking around the table with deliberate slowness. You see, the problem with all these joint operations proposals is that they give subordinates ideas above their station. SEALs, Marines, Air Force Special Operators, they start thinking they're equal partners rather than tools to be deployed as directed. Jake's hands clenched slightly under the table. The casual dismissal of the men and women who actually did the fighting struck a nerve that Blackwood couldn't possibly understand. These weren't tools, they were highly trained professionals who put their lives on the line for missions that desk-bound officers planned from comfortable offices. Admiral, Colonel Mitchell interjected diplomatically, I think what we're all trying to achieve here is maximum operational effectiveness through improved coordination. Blackwood's attention snapped to her like a laser sight finding its target. Colonel Mitchell, I don't recall asking for your opinion. When I want input from the Marines, I'll request it explicitly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Colonel Mitchell had 2 Purple Hearts and a Silver Star from her tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Dismissing her contribution so casually was not just unprofessional, it was insulting to every service member who'd ever bled for their country. Jake watched the exchange with growing anger. He'd served under good leaders and bad ones, but Blackwood represented something worse than incompetence. This was active disrespect for the people who made his comfortable position possible. Admiral Vance tried again. Sir, perhaps we could review the specific metrics that support enhanced joint operations. The success rates speak for themselves. Admiral Vance, Blackwood said, turning to face her directly, I'm beginning to question whether you understand the difference between making suggestions and making policy. Your job is to implement decisions, not to challenge them with statistics and data points. The insult hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Admiral Vance had more combat experience than most of the men in the room combined. She'd commanded ships in hostile waters and made life-or-death decisions that Blackwood could never comprehend. Reducing her to a simple implementer of policy was both factually wrong and professionally devastating. Jake felt his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. He'd seen good officers destroyed by political animals like Blackwood, and he'd learned to recognize the pattern. First came the dismissal of expertise, then the systematic undermining of authority, and finally the complete destruction of careers built on actual service and sacrifice. The worst part was that everyone in the room knew what was happening, but the military hierarchy made challenging a superior officer's behavior nearly impossible. Blackwood held all the cards, and he was clearly enjoying the game. Captain Hayes had been right to be concerned. This briefing wasn't about operational effectiveness or joint training protocols. It was about Admiral Blackwood asserting dominance and putting people in their place. The problem was that some people, particularly those who'd earned their positions through blood and courage rather than politics, weren't as easy to intimidate as Blackwood assumed. Jake Morrison was definitely one of those people, and Admiral Blackwood was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Admiral Blackwood continued his verbal assault on Admiral Vance, seemingly oblivious to the growing tension in the room. His voice carried the smugness of someone who believed his rank made him untouchable. Furthermore, Blackwood continued, pacing behind the seated officers like a predator circling prey, I think we need to address the elephant in the room regarding special operations personnel. They seem to have developed an inflated sense of their own importance. Jake's jaw tightened. He'd lost 17 teammates over 12 years of service. Each name was burned into his memory, each face appearing in quiet moments when he thought about the cost of the missions they'd completed. Calling their sacrifice and expertise an inflated sense of importance crossed a line that shouldn't exist. SEALs in particular, Blackwood said, his eyes finding Jake across the table, seem to think that their specialized training makes them somehow special, that they deserve different treatment or consideration than regular Navy personnel. The room's atmosphere grew electric with tension. Every officer present understood the dangerous territory Blackwood was entering. Disrespecting Special Operations Forces wasn't just poor leadership. It was potentially catastrophic for morale and operational effectiveness. Lieutenant Colonel Park looked up from his notepad for the first time, his expression showing genuine concern. He'd worked with SEAL teams before and knew their value wasn't theoretical or political. Colonel Rodriguez's face had gone stone cold, his own Special Forces background making him acutely aware of what Blackwood was really saying. "Admiral Blackwood," Admiral Vance said carefully, "I think we should focus on the operational aspects of that you should focus on listening when your superior officer is speaking. This constant interruption is exactly the kind of insubordination I'm talking about." The insult was so blatant and unprofessional that several officers visibly winced. Admiral Vance had been trying to steer the conversation back to productive territory, and Blackwood's response was to publicly humiliate her in front of her peers. Jake Morrison had reached his limit. "Sir," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying the dangerous calm that his teammates recognized as a warning sign. With all due respect, Admiral Vance was attempting to maintain focus on mission-critical objectives.
Every head in the room turned toward Jake.
Speaking up in defense of a superior officer against another superior officer was walking into a minefield. But Jake had never been one to back down from necessary conflicts, regardless of the personal cost. Admiral Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he focused entirely on Jake. "Lieutenant Commander Morrison, was I addressing you? Then perhaps you could explain why you feel entitled to insert yourself into a conversation between admiral officers." The question was loaded with threat and condescension. Blackwood was clearly looking for an excuse to put Jake in his place, to make an example that would reinforce his authority over everyone present. Jake stood up slowly, his movement controlled and deliberate. At 6'2", with a lean, muscular build honed by years of combat training, he presented a stark contrast to Blackwood's soft, administrative appearance. "Sir, I felt it was appropriate to clarify that Admiral Vance was attempting to serve the mission's best interests." "The mission's best interests," Blackwood repeated mockingly, moving closer to where Jake stood. "And I suppose you consider yourself qualified to determine what those interests are?" "I consider myself qualified to recognize professional competence and effective leadership when I see it, sir." The response was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Blackwood's face flushed red as the implication hit him. Jake hadn't directly called him incompetent, but everyone in the room understood the subtext. "You arrogant son of a bitch," Blackwood snarled, abandoning any pretense of professional decorum. "You think because you've played soldier in some third-world hellholes that you understand strategy? Policy? Leadership?" Jake remained perfectly still, his expression neutral despite the volcanic anger building inside him. "I think I understand the difference between leadership and bullying, sir." The room went dead silent. Jake had just crossed the Rubicon, and everyone knew it. Directly challenging a superior officer's leadership style was grounds for court-martial, but Jake had calculated that Blackwood's behavior was already so far out of line that formal charges would require explanation that the Admiral wouldn't want to provide. Blackwood's face went from red to purple with rage. "How dare you speak to me like that? Do you have any idea who I am? What I can do to your career?" "I know exactly who you are, sir," Jake replied calmly. "And I know what you can do to my career. The question is whether you know who I am and what I've done to earn my place in this room." Admiral Vance started to stand, clearly attempting to defuse the situation before it spiraled completely out of control. "Gentlemen, perhaps we should—" "Sit down!" Blackwood roared at her, wheeling around with wild eyes. "I've had enough of your interference." That's when Admiral Blackwood made his fatal mistake. In his rage, he stepped directly into Jake's personal space, close enough that spittle from his shouting landed on Jake's uniform. Close enough that Jake could smell the coffee on his breath and see the burst blood vessels in his eyes. "You're nothing," Blackwood hissed, his face inches from Jake's. "A dressed-up killer who follows orders. That's all you are, and that's all you'll ever be. So when I tell you to shut your mouth and know your place, you'll do exactly that." Jake Morrison had been called worse things by better men. He'd been tortured by professionals and threatened by terrorists who actually had the skills to back up their words. Admiral Blackwood's verbal assault was amateur hour, compared to what Jake had endured in service to his country. But when Blackwood raised his hand and jabbed his finger into Jake's chest for emphasis, everything changed. Physical contact crossed the line from verbal disagreement to assault. In Jake's world, that was the difference between a heated discussion and a combat situation. His training and instincts, honed by years of life-or-death encounters, took over before his conscious mind could intervene. The movement was so fast that most people in the room didn't actually see what happened. 1 second, Admiral Blackwood was pointing his finger at Jake's chest. The next second, he was on the floor, flat on his back, with Jake standing over him in a position that could have been a combat stance if Jake had chosen to make it one. "Sir," Jake said quietly, his voice deadly calm, "I strongly recommend that you do not put your hands on me again." Admiral Blackwood lay on the expensive carpet, his perfect uniform now wrinkled and disheveled, his carefully styled hair messed up from the impact with the floor. His eyes were wide with shock and something that might have been fear. The entire incident had lasted less than 3 seconds from initial contact to resolution. Jake hadn't thrown a punch or applied any hold that could be considered assault. He'd simply redirected Blackwood's aggressive movement with a technique designed to neutralize threat without causing injury. But the psychological impact was devastating. Admiral Theodore Blackwood, the man who'd been intimidating senior officers just moments before, now lay on the floor, looking up at a Navy SEAL who hadn't even raised his voice. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so completely and suddenly that everyone was still processing what they'd witnessed. Jake extended his hand toward the fallen admiral. "Sir, let me help you up." Blackwood stared at the offered hand, like it was a venomous snake. His entire worldview had just been shattered by a demonstration of what real capability looked like. All his bluster and positional authority meant nothing when faced with someone who'd earned their respect through actual skill and sacrifice. The room remained frozen in tableau, officers sitting at the conference table with expressions ranging from shock to barely concealed satisfaction, Admiral Blackwood on the floor trying to process his humiliation, and Jake Morrison standing calmly with his hand extended, waiting to see what would happen next. Outside, the normal sounds of base life continued. Sailors going about their duties, aircraft taking off and landing, the eternal rhythm of military life. But inside that conference room, something fundamental had changed, and everyone present knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again. Admiral Blackwood remained on the floor for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 seconds. His face cycled through emotions like a broken traffic light: shock, rage, embarrassment, and finally something approaching calculation. He was clearly trying to figure out how to salvage his authority from this unprecedented situation. Jake kept his hand extended, maintaining the pretense that this was simply one officer helping another who had fallen. Everyone in the room understood the fiction, but it provided a face-saving opportunity that might prevent the situation from escalating further. "I don't need your help," Blackwood finally growled, pushing himself up from the carpet. His uniform was wrinkled, his dignity severely dented, but he was mobile and apparently uninjured. Jake lowered his hand and took a small step back, giving the Admiral space while maintaining a respectful but alert posture. "Yes, sir. My apologies if I reacted too quickly when you stumbled." The word "stumbled" hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Jake was offering Blackwood a way to reframe the incident, not as a demonstration of superior skill over inferior bluster, but as a simple accident followed by an overly helpful response. Admiral Vance was the first to break the stunned silence. "Admiral Blackwood, are you injured? Should we call for medical assistance?" Her professional concern provided another layer of cover for what had actually happened. If Blackwood was injured, it was from a fall, not from being expertly taken down by a Navy SEAL who could have done much worse with the same effort. "I'm fine," Blackwood snapped, straightening his uniform and trying to restore some semblance of dignity. His hair was still messed up, and there was carpet lint on his shoulder, but he was attempting to project command presence. The problem was that everyone in the room had seen behind the curtain. They'd witnessed what happened when artificial authority met genuine competence, and the result had been swift and decisive. Colonel Rodriguez cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should take a short recess to regroup and review our objectives for this briefing." It was a masterful suggestion that allowed everyone to pretend normalcy while giving Blackwood time to recover his composure. Jake appreciated the gesture, even though he suspected that Rodriguez had enjoyed watching the Admiral's comeuppance. "That won't be necessary," Blackwood said, but his voice lacked its earlier commanding tone. "Lieutenant Commander Morrison, please take your seat." Jake nodded and sat down, his movements calm and controlled. He'd accomplished what he needed to accomplish. Blackwood's abusive behavior had been checked, and the other officers in the room had witnessed that the Admiral's bark was significantly worse than his bite. Admiral Blackwood returned to his position at the head of the table, but something fundamental had changed. His earlier swagger was gone, replaced by a more cautious demeanor. He kept glancing at Jake, as if trying to assess whether there might be other surprises waiting. "As I was saying," Blackwood began, then stopped. He'd been in the middle of insulting special operations personnel when the confrontation began, and returning to that topic seemed suddenly inadvisable. Admiral Vance smoothly filled the silence. "Sir, perhaps we could return to the operational proposals we were reviewing. The joint training protocols show significant promise for improving mission effectiveness." This time Blackwood didn't interrupt her. "Yes, Admiral Vance, please continue with your presentation." The rest of the briefing proceeded with remarkable civility. Blackwood asked reasonable questions, listened to responses without commentary, and even acknowledged the expertise of the officers present. It was as if he'd been replaced by a completely different person. Jake contributed to the discussion when appropriate, his comments professional and insightful. He made no reference to the earlier confrontation, treating Blackwood with the same respect he'd shown before the incident. To an outside observer, it might have seemed like nothing significant had happened, but everyone in that room knew better. When the briefing concluded an hour later, the atmosphere was completely different from when it had begun. Officers filed out with expressions of relief mixed with amazement. Several of them nodded to Jake as they passed, acknowledgements of respect that spoke volumes about how they'd perceived the morning's events. Admiral Vance was the last to leave, pausing at Jake's chair as he gathered his notes. "Lieutenant Commander Morrison," she said quietly. "A word." They walked out together, leaving Admiral Blackwood alone in the conference room, with his thoughts and his damaged pride. Once they were in the hallway, Admiral Vance turned to face Jake directly. "That was either the most professional thing I've ever seen, or the most dangerous. I'm still trying to decide which." Jake met her gaze steadily. "Ma'am, I simply helped a superior officer who had lost his balance. Nothing more than that." She smiled slightly. "Of course. And I suppose the fact that Admiral Blackwood suddenly rediscovered his manners afterward was completely coincidental?" "I couldn't say, ma'am. Perhaps he realized that productive discussion requires mutual respect." Admiral Vance nodded slowly. "Jake, may I call you Jake? What you did in there was risky. Blackwood has political connections and a long memory. This isn't over." "I understand that, ma'am. But some things are worth the risk." "Indeed they are." She paused, studying his face. "For what it's worth, you did the right thing. Blackwood has been bullying officers for years and no one has ever called him on it." "Maybe it was time someone did." Jake shrugged. "I just reacted to what I saw as unprofessional behavior toward a superior officer. You deserve better than that, ma'am." 3 days later, Jake was called to Captain Hayes' office. He'd been expecting this meeting since the moment Admiral Blackwood had hit the floor. "Sit down, Jake," Hayes said, his expression unreadable.
"We need to talk about what happened in that briefing." Jake remained at attention.
"Yes, sir. Admiral Blackwood filed a report claiming that you assaulted him during an official meeting. Sir, I helped Admiral Blackwood after he lost his balance and fell."
Several officers witnessed the incident. Hayes leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Funny thing about those witness statements, every single officer in that room described the exact same sequence of events. Admiral Blackwood stumbled, you helped prevent him from falling harder, and everyone moved on. Very consistent testimony. Jake said nothing, but he felt a wave of relief. His fellow officers had closed ranks to protect him, understanding that what he'd done was necessary and justified. "There's more," Hayes continued. "Admiral Vance filed her own report praising your professionalism and quick reflexes in preventing what could have been a serious injury to a senior officer. Colonel Rodriguez submitted a similar commendation." The irony wasn't lost on Jake. By helping Blackwood save face, he'd created a situation where punishing him would require the Admiral to admit what had really happened, that he'd been manhandled by a subordinate after behaving like a bully. "However," Hayes said, his tone becoming more serious, "Admiral Blackwood has requested that you be transferred out of his command area, effective immediately." "Hey," Jake nodded. He'd expected this outcome. "Where am I being reassigned, sir?" Hayes smiled broadly now. "DevGru wants you for a new counter-terrorism task force. Seems your reputation for handling difficult situations has gotten some attention at the highest levels." Congratulations, Lieutenant Commander. You're going back to the teams. DEVRU, the Navy's most elite Special Operations Unit, formerly known as SEAL Team 6. It was a promotion disguised as a lateral transfer, a way of rewarding Jake while getting him out of Blackwood's reach. There's one more thing, Hayes added. Admiral Blackwood's behavior in that briefing apparently wasn't isolated. Several officers have come forward with complaints about his management style. There's going to be an investigation, and he'll likely be reassigned to a position with less direct command authority. Jake felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal vindication. Good officers like Admiral Vance deserve to work without fear of retaliation or harassment. If his actions had helped create that environment, then the personal cost was worth it. 6 months later, Jake Morrison was leading a task force in Syria, doing what he did best, protecting American interests through skill, courage, and decisive action. Admiral Theodore Blackwood was pushing papers in a Pentagon office, far from any operational command. The story of what happened in that briefing room became legend throughout the Navy. Details were embellished and expanded with each telling, but the core message remained consistent. Respect is earned, not demanded, and sometimes it takes courage to stand up for what's right, regardless of the consequences. Jake never spoke about the incident publicly, maintaining the fiction that he'd simply helped a fellow officer who had stumbled. But among the Special Operations community, he was known as the SEAL who'd reminded everyone that rank means nothing without the character to back it up. Admiral Patricia Vance went on to command the Pacific Fleet, implementing joint training protocols that improved operational effectiveness across all service branches. Her leadership style, based on competence and mutual respect rather than intimidation, became a model for the next generation of military officers. And in briefing rooms throughout the Navy, whenever an officer started acting like rank gave them permission to abuse their subordinates, someone would inevitably tell the story of Admiral Blackwood and the SEAL who taught him about respect. The story served as both warning and inspiration, a reminder that true authority comes from character, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not against foreign enemies, but against the bullies in our own ranks. The incident lasted only seconds, but its impact continues to ripple through the military hierarchy, reminding everyone that leadership is about service, not power, and that sometimes the most professional thing you can do is help someone who's lost their balance, in more ways than one.